everyone, thanks for joining and welcome to my talk about Nuxt.js and the composition API. Before we start, a few words about me. So I'm Alex, I'm a Nuxt.js core maintainer and I have a Twitter account, as many of you have as well, I guess. So if you have any questions, just feel free to DM me there. And a blog as well, where I write about Nuxt.js, Vue, obviously, JavaScript, refactoring, clean code, SEO, all the cool stuff. So yeah, check it out if you want to. And I'm working as a web dev consultant at my own self-funded company Development. So before we get into all the nitty-gritty details, let's check the status quo of the composition API. So as you know, Vue 3 and the composition API are out for roughly 2 months now, but still the ecosystem has to catch up with both Vue 3 and the composition API. So the good thing is more and more libraries actually provide composables, for example, Vue Apollo or Vue 18n, and even better, these composables are mostly not only compatible to Vue 3, but also to Vue 2 and the composition API. So this combination really makes a viable option now. And even better, it makes a really viable option now because the plugin, the Vue 2 composition API plugin, is still in beta, but not marked as experimental anymore. So let's take a look at the goals of the Vue 2.x composition API plugin. And these are mainly from the README here. That states that the primary goal is to provide a way to experiment with the API and collect feedback. So this definitely makes sense, right? So people can try the API out and give feedback. Especially this was important during the RFC process where the API was still in the making. But right now it's still important, so Vue 2.x projects can taste a bit of composition API. But there's also another goal that's written a bit further down. And it's about migration. So it says when you migrate to Vue 3, just replacing Vue composition API to Vue and your code should just work. So making the migration at some point later on easier is also a goal here. Yeah, and I think these two things are important to keep in mind. So the good thing again is composition API plugin can be used with Nuxt without any problems. So you can just add it, register it in the Nuxt plugin, and this will work out of the box. You can use ref, reactive, watch, and so on. All good. But of course, I wouldn't give a talk on the topic if there weren't some issues. So the first thing is that it's a Vue composition API plugin that of course does not cover Nuxt specific functionalities, like assigning access in the context, or like setting meta tags, or also data fetching with fetch tracing data. This is not covered at all. And the second point is, what is with server-side rendering? The Vue composition API plugin gives us unserver prefetch as a hook, but yeah, nothing more. And that's the reason why there is a Nuxt.js composition API module, which is a superset of the Vue composition API. So it includes it, but even more. And even more means composables for Nuxt-specific functionalities. As I said, data fetching, context, and also setting meta tags. And even more, it also includes TypeScript support for plugins, middleware, and more. But we'll see that in a few seconds. And this module is under the Nuxt community umbrella, so it's in this organization, and currently maintained by Daniel Rowe. Thank you, Daniel. So the goals, let's look at the goals of that module. And I would say they are very similar to the Vue composition API package goals there. Because the first goal is that we want to provide you, developers, a way to use the composition API with Nuxt and Vue 2 in its full beauty. Yeah, like almost no limits. That means not only in sub-components, but also in page components, and also with all these Nuxt-specific functionalities. And of course, there's the second one. So again, getting feedback for the current implementation, but also maybe for composables in the future, or ideas, what is missing, what could be added. And this is also part of figuring out how to use composables with an SSR framework, because this is clearly something new. And the third one is basically, again, making migration for the future easier. But as a notice there, the API of Nuxt-specific composables will likely change before Nuxt 3 is released. Also because we're learning more and more, and as Nuxt 3 matures, more functionalities are coming and things will likely change. Yeah, but talking about Nuxt 3, well, we will publish a page with a status and roadmap really soon. So as the tweet says there, this year, really soon. There you'll find out then what's still to do, what has been achieved, and so on. So yeah, that's it. No other secret reveals, unfortunately, but better than nothing. Okay, so let's talk about definition helpers, the first component of this module, though it's not a real component. So definition helpers are these things or functions in this case that improve developer experience. So I said before TypeScript improvements, but it also helps with IntelliSense and autocomplete. So I'm not a TypeScript user myself, I have to admit, but still this helps me because my IDE can now give me better type completion and better hints. Also, these are not strictly related to the composition API, so you could use them completely without using composition API just for the better DX, but still it's good to deliver them with that package because it feels right to bundle them the same way. And essentially, there are a bunch of no-op functions, so they don't do anything unless giving autocomplete and TS support, similar like define component. And yeah, some examples, of course. So the first one is if you create a Nuxt plugin, then you usually write export default function and then of course the function, and you don't have really good TS support there. So what you can do is wrap this function you would normally use as default export and wrap that with a define Nuxt plugin call, and that's it. So move the function as the first argument inside this call, and there you go. Then you have auto completion for context and inject. Nice. And same goes for middleware. So exactly the same scenario. And there's one bonus, and the only full TypeScript example I have in this presentation. As I said, I don't use it, but it's define Nuxt module. So here you can actually provide your own module options. So if you write modules frequently, this will improve the developer experience a lot, especially for TS users, as I said. Okay, so these are definition helpers. We also have one for server middleware, but you see, using them is it has no overhead, and it shouldn't bring any problems, only good things. Yeah, and let's talk about common composables. So, but before we dive into them, let's do a quick recap on fetch in Nuxt.js. So fetch in Nuxt.js is the new fetch. Yeah, already quite a bit old, but still it's a new fetch, is a way to fetch data. And how do we do that? So I brought a small code example, only 12 lines. And okay, we import Axios, and then of course this is the script part of a component, of a Vue single file component. Then we define it. So we define the component from line 3 on, and in line 4 to 8 we define our data function that returns mountains, and it's set to an empty array, so the default value. And then in line 9 to 11 we have our async fetch function. In this fetch function we set this.mountains to the result of our Axios call to the Nuxt.js dev API. And then we get an array with all the cool mountain information. Okay, makes sense so far? Good. I bet most of you have seen it already. So now, how can we use it in the composition API? We don't have access to this. We also don't use data, and there is no like fetch. Well, of course we use a composable, and there we go. We use useFetch, and this should work like the fetch method of Nuxt.js we've just seen. So this example is not really longer. I mean, 2 lines, but also only because I use lots of spaces. So there's not much overhead of converting. So in terms of readability, I'd even say it's more readable, but we'll come to that. But the first thing you should notice is line 1 and 4. So I've mentioned define component briefly, just for improving, again, TypeScript support and IntelliSense. And we also import ref and useFetch. I mean, sure, we import useFetch from the composition API package, but also ref and also define component. So why is that even possible? Well, the reason is that Nuxt.js or Nuxt.js composition API package, it re-exports all the exports from the composition API. So you don't have to fiddle around with 2 packages. You can just import all these goodies from one source and it's all good. Also to note, we've improved or enhanced the define component method a little, but we'll come to that in a bit because it's mostly relevant for meta tags. Right, so we've imported all these things and also Axios again. And then we have our setup function. In our setup function, we create a new variable, mountains, and set it to ref with the default value of an empty array. Okay, so far so good. And now in line 8 to 10, we have our useFetch function, which is called synchronously, but takes an async function as argument. And now you see that this async function looks pretty much like our fetch function from the example before, when you don't use the composition API. So in there, we set the value of that mountains ref to the result of the Axios call. Same logic, right? And eventually we return our mountains ref so it can be used in the template. Nice. So yeah, that's it. And I would say it's a bit more readable and it's not really longer. Nice. But yeah, some of you might ask now, okay, but what is if I want to refetch data? What is with fetch state? I can't access them, right? But well, of course you can. That's a good thing. useFetch returns an object which you can destructure to fetch and fetch state. So this works. You can use them in, of course, watchers, computer property, and so on. And you don't have to return them in the setup function because they're already in the template. So 2 more things you don't have to do. Cool. Okay, that's it for useFetch. But now you might ask, okay, I don't want to import Axios everywhere. We have this Axios module in Nuxt, or I want to use HTTP or whatever. What to do there? Well, this is where you need the context. And the context is, you probably know the context from async data. It's a place that stores lots of info about the route, the store, all the module references, and so on. So if you use async data in Nuxt, which was there also before fetch for data fetching, you know that you can't use this inside async data. This was always a bummer, but this happens because async data is executed before the component is initialized. So there is no this, and that's why we have this context argument, also CTX, that is the first parameter of async data, and that is passed in from Nuxt that you can use to get the side parameters, access to modules, to the store, and so on. So in here, in line 3, I get the Slack parameter from the route, or from the router. This is a kind of shorthand. And then in line 4, I do an API call. Of course, async data can be async, hence the name. And in line 5, I dispatch an action, just for sake of an example. And that's it. So the store gives us lots of opportunities here. But again, the context gives us lots of opportunities here. But again, how can we use them in context of the composition API? And the answer is another composable. Use context. Cool. So how does it work? Well, again, you import use context, and then on line 8, you just get the context out of the function. Again, called synchronously. And that's it. You have access to a store, can dispatch actions. You have access to the HTTP module, for example, line 14. But there is one thing that's quite interesting in line 11 and 12, actually. So in there, you see we can get the params like we did before. But now it seems like params is a ref. And that's true. Params is a reactive reference, so you have to use a computer property to get, for example, the slug out of these params. But it's good because that means it's fully reactive. And that's also something totally new. So this works great, and we will have a use case for this later on. So yeah, now we can use our HTTP module, for example. We can get the slug. Why not fetch again some data? And this is what we will do now with use async. So the subheading already gives it away. It's another way to fetch data. You know, you can use useFetch, and it's all good. There's nothing wrong with useFetch, but there's also use async, and it works slightly like async data, but it's a bit different. So in line 8, we see const post equals the result of this use async call. And in use async, we again provide a function that returns a promise, or it could be an async function, doesn't matter. So what happens now? Well, use async will return a ref with a null value at first, and then tries to resolve this call and then mutate the ref for you. So the same thing you did manually in useFetch, you can do now with use async without being very verbose. You can basically just set posts to resolve use async, and use async will mutate and return the correct ref for you. Yeah, that's it. And now we could say, well, this sounds like async data, and yes. So let's take a look how this works in SSR context. So we have again our useAsync call, and on the initial request, saying or imagining that we are using a dynamic server-side rendering, but it's more or less the same when using static side. The request from the client goes to the Node.js server, and the Node.js server is doing the useAsync call. Okay, so far so good. We get a response, and now the Node.js server is sending the HTML and JavaScript, including this useAsync response already serialized, to the client back. And then the client does hydration, it deserializes the state, it does, and it has a Vue instance already again. And useAsync is not called again. It's only called on the server, and the data can be used directly on the client. So this means for the initial request, useAsync is only called on the server, not called again on the client side. This is pretty important. And basically, all the hydration and serialization stuff is done for you thanks to Nuxt Composition API. So again, this works like async data. Yeah, it really does. But let's look at the client-side navigation. So when you navigate to another page on the client side, then it's a bit different because, again, then post is null and useAsync is called on the navigation. So imagine you're navigating to the page that has this useAsync call, not away from it. This wouldn't make sense. So the problem is, of course, we can't call the node server again. It's all client side. So useAsync is called on the client side, and the API responds with a value, and then posts has the value, of course, if the call succeeded and so on. That means for all further requests after an initial request, useAsync is called on the client side. But the important point here, the navigation won't be blocked. And this is one of the major differences to async data. So that's why I say it's not the exact equivalent of async data, but kind of. They're quite similar. For example, they're both blocking on the server side because we want the result to be in the HTML there. And both can be executed on the server or client side or end client side, depending on what's needed. So never on both sides on the same request, but yeah, as we just saw. And there is no built-in way to refetch data, nor some state check like fetch. I mean, you can always check for the ref and say if ref is not null, then do something, but fetch has some more advanced state checking. And the difference to async data and useAsync is mainly that useAsync is not blocking on the client side. This is important on the client side, while async data is blocking. And there's another one that is not that important, but data from useAsync is not merged with data because there is no data in the composition API world. Right. So these are two ways of fetching data. And believe me or not, we have another one. So we have useStatic, and it's meant for expensive functions plus static site generation. It can also be used with dynamic server-side rendering, but yeah, the idea is to run expensive functions on build only. So, okay, this maybe slightly reminds of Fwdays. It borrows kind of the concept, but it's not the same. Though don't forget Fwdays works with all of that. Okay, so another code example, and okay, what we'll see here. Okay, we get the params again, and the slug again, line 3 and 4, and then line 5 onwards, we have conspire equals useStatic, and then we have 3 parameters or 3 arguments, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and we'll take a look. So the first one is called the factory function, and then we have the second one, which is the parameter or the key, however I want to call it, and the third one is the key base, which should be unique across the project. So let's see how this works during generation. We don't know what it does yet, but you'll figure out in a bit. During the generation, this factory function will be executed. So it will take as arguments the parameter and the key base, so 2 and 3. As we don't need 3, we just take 2, all good, and it will be executed. And the result will be saved as JSON named by the parameter and key base. So this is why I say it's similar to Fwdays, or to what happens during Fwdays. So the state will be saved, or the result will be saved. So saying the slug would be Sternburg, then the file will be saved under /static/bs-sternburg.json in your dist folder. So this means you don't have to call an API when the site is running, right? And we'll check that out. When your generated site is live now, and you have the code, what is happening on the initial request? Well, initial request, you get your CDN to respond with some HTML and JS, and it includes the JSON result inlined already. So you don't have to fetch some JSON. It's already inlined in the HTML that has been generated. And on client-side navigation is a bit different because you get the static from the static the JSON from the static folder. So instead of calling an API, instead of calling the factory function, it will call or ask for the JSON. And if it's there, all good, then you get the content. But if it fails, so if the call to JSON fails for whatever reason, maybe it's not generated on build, maybe it's a dynamic page and so on, then the factory function will be run on client-side. Anyway, the content will always be cached afterwards. So yeah, pretty cool function again to run only like very expensive functions that users might not want to wait for, or data that's not like real time, and save them to JSON. So persisting them on build. Cool. Okay, so we have useStatic as well, and now we have another composable, which is called onGlobalSetup, and this is more a category of a helper, but still a very good one, because it's used to inject things globally the Vue way through provide inject, not the Nuxt inject, don't mix it up. And yeah, it's a great place for like global layout independent composables. And often it's used in Nuxt.js plugin, it's in this case. Right, so think about that. You want to add like your API repositories, your helpers, your Apollo client. So a small code example, this is how you would provide the Apollo client with Nuxt, given you have the composables for Apollo and Nuxt Apollo running. So you would like bridge the gap here. You could also provide like your app name or whatever, but this is fully up to you. And we will need this for our next example with the next composable, which is useMeta. Yeah, you guessed it. This is missing. We have to manipulate hat data easily with useMeta, and there our defined component is very important, because to make it work, because of reactivity issues and because useMeta is what it is and it's not fully compatible with Vue 3 or the composition API yet, there had to be a few workarounds. So what you need is, so the component you're targeting has to use defined component, and it needs this hat object setup due to reactivity things. So those conditions have to be fulfilled, otherwise you get an error. And then you can use useMeta. There are a couple of ways to use useMeta easily. So the first one is, obviously, you can just set them. So useMeta, you call them with an object with your metadata, and that's it. But another really cool scenario is you can get refs for metadata. Also, not for all of them, but separately. So for the title, description, and so on. Nice. So you can call useMeta as a return value. You get an object you can destructure, and you get like title or meta and so on. And we will utilize that in a bit. So, and if you change, of course, to ref, then useMeta will correctly show the new title. And it's also possible the other way around, which is called computed meta. So you can have a ref and then just pass in a function that will be treated as computed property. And then when the ref changes, again, the function will be re-executed because everything is reactive. And there you go. Okay, so these are the three ways. And one of them we will use in our example for canonical links. So if you don't know what canonical links are, no worries. This is this part here, just taken from my personal site, which is basically just a link to the site, but a special one. It is more or less important for SEO. It is there to avoid duplicate content and also to define what is the preferred URL or the master copy of your page. If you're interested in SEO, so I talked about a bit about SEO in Vue, so I explained it a bit more in depth. Feel free to check that out. But yeah, let's start with the implementation. The most important part here is about the preferred URL. You want to decide, do you use www in front, like I do here, or not? Do you use a trailing slash, so a slash at the end, or not? And yeah, I decided for trailing slash and for www, and let's see how we can implement that. Okay, so we have our first small composable, which is called useCurrentURL. And obviously the name already hints we want the current URL. Nice. So how does it work? Well, first of all, we use context. Okay, and we get the route and $config, which is the runtime config. It's more or less a good way to use env variables. If you don't know about it yet, more or less new feature, check it out. So already out for a bit, but maybe for some of you new, really worth looking into that. Okay, then I usually save my base URL, so HTTPS :/ and so on. I save this through the env variables and have it accessible because I don't want to hard code that. So I get this out of that runtime config, $config value. Okay, and now, because we learned already that route is reactive, it's a ref, we get the new compute property which we will return from the base URL and then the path coming from route, so route.value.path. So we just chain the current path of the application with our base URL and we get the current URL. Nice. And this is important because we want to display the current URL as our canonical link. But well, we have to transform it a bit. But here I already choose the www part because inside the base URL, now we already now we only have to cover the // part. And now we have our useCanonical composable, which is a bit larger, but still 26 lines, fairly okay. Okay, so what are we doing? Of course, in line 5, we use our current URL, which we just wrote, and it's a commuted property again. And we need to decide on // which we will do in our next computer property called URL with /. We decide to use it, so to use the /. So let's take the URL, and if it ends with a /, don't add anything, otherwise add a / and return URL plus suffix. Okay, not too complicated. Again, all reactive, all good. And then in line 12, now it gets a bit more complicated. So before we get into canonical link index, we have to think about what is being passed into our composition function or composable. This will be a ref again. It's called link here, and this will come eventually from Vue meta. And if you don't know how this is structured, it's no problem. It's an array, and it's an array of objects. And these objects can have specific values, obviously, in specific keys. So we want to find our canonical link if it exists. So we check the rel and check if it's canonical. And this happens in line 12. But important here is that we don't want the whole object because we don't care what's written inside there. We want the index position in the array. So we get that here. And why do we want the index position? Because we want to remove this canonical link if it's already in there. So to make place for a new one. You could also override this, but removing and replacing is easier for example here. So in line 14, we have this function called remove link if exists. And this is exactly what the function does. Very important for naming. So in line 15, we check if the link exists. So does the link exist? Yes, it exists if the value of canonical link index is not -1, which means that the index has not been found. And if the link exists, we have to continue. If the link does not exist, we can return and stop because we don't have to remove anything if it's not there. But otherwise, in line 19, we take the array from link.value and remove the item via splice. Okay. So we now have a way to find out if there is a canonical link there already, to remove it. And what's missing is to add the new one, okay, for sure, and to trigger these things. And this is happening in line 22 to 25. So we have a watcher on there. So we just watch the current URL. As it's ref, all good. And if the current URL changes, then we execute the watcher function, which basically says remove the link if it exists, and then afterwards push the new value with rel canonical and the correct href, which is URL with /, which we've defined above as computer property. In line 25, this is quite important. We also want to trigger that immediately because we want to have a canonical link directly. By the way, triggering watchers immediately is also possible in Vue 2, just as a heads up. But it's really nice that it's very straightforward in the composition API. Nice. And then we need the Nuxt plugin. So we have, we could use the file Nuxt plugin here, but I omitted it for sake of brevity. We have on-global setup here because we want to do this directly on the global setup. And then we take the link ref from useMeta and pass it into useCanonical. And that's it. We're done. Nice. I think, yeah, we added a new function with small building blocks. I mean, we could use like use current URL somewhere else as well. And this is fully layered independent. It works across all layouts, and there we go. So before wrapping up and talking also about the gotchas, I want to introduce a new kind of ref. This is more or less a low-level block, so you might not need it at all in your composition API or your own composables, but it's still important that you know what's going on. And the new ref is an SSR ref, which is a ref with SSR in mind. So what does it mean? Okay, let's go a step back. Well, as I mentioned before, state from the server needs to be transferred from the server to the client. So the server needs to serialize that, JSON, JSONP, whatever. The client needs to deserialize that. So take that JSON and transform it. Only on initial request, only on server-side rendering. And this happens already with window.__nuxt__. And the good thing is you don't have to do this manually when using composition API, because SSR ref will already do that for you. It will already handle all these things, all the hydration stuff too. So if you need a ref that works on server side and client side, then you can use an SSR ref. Okay, so how would it look like? We import it, of course, again, and then we create a variable, say set from, to an empty SSR ref. And now on line 4, we set the value depending on whether the process is server process or client process. So it's whether an initial request, then we set to server, otherwise to client. And if it's an initial request, then the value will be set to server on the server side. It will be transmitted to the client, serialized through window.__nuxt__. Hard to pronounce. And that's it. And on client side, it will just be set to client and all good. So this doesn't look like crazy new feature, but it's very convenient that you don't have to do that on your own. Right. And also, if you want to, it accepts a setup function. So that's also a good option. And I said new refs. I just showed you one, but there are way more. So we also have, of course, the shallow version of SSR ref, which is, yeah, shallow SSR ref. Nice. We have a rec ref, which is a ref that resets itself per request. And also we have a rec SSR ref, which is the SSR version of that one. So if you want to know more about them, please check out the docs, because they're, like, again, many low-level building blocks, and I have to come to the end in a few minutes. But I think what is equally or even more important are the gotchas. Yeah, there's always something, right? So some helpers are using keys under the hood for serialization, which is most important. Our composable use async, which we've seen before, but also SSRF and the shallow version, and SSR promise, which I haven't even mentioned yet. So if you want to know more about it, check out the docs. So when you use these helpers in global components, then please ensure that they use a unique key. And now I say, a unique key? Where do you have to set the key? Yeah, I haven't told you yet. So let's take a small code example. We have a composable, which is called useGetFancyResult. Okay, interesting name. And in line 4, well, we set up an SSRF. Okay, and then we do something and return the result. Okay, all good. And now 9 and 10, we call this function twice and use A and B. And now in line 12, we set the value from B to 00. And guess what? Now A.value is also 00. Why? Because they use internally the same key. What's happening that SSRF and all the other helpers I mentioned the slide before, they all take a key as second argument. I say, okay, what, they have all the same key if you don't set one, why they're maybe all undefined? No, it's not that bad. If you don't set one, then a Babel plugin will automatically add them. So this will look like this. But you see the problem already, right? It's not added per function call. It's just like added directly straight in there. If you call the function twice, the key is the same. And that's the gotcha. So how can we resolve that? Well, we can just pass in a key as a function argument. So as the first one or second or whatever. And that's it. We passed along as the second argument of SSRF2. And now in line 9 and 10, we just say, okay, A and B as keys and set B.value to no problem. And it is really no problem because A is not no problem. So, all good. Great. There is also another issue, which is shared server state, which is always a problem when you have like global refs on the server side or in general global objects on the server side. So keep in mind that they are also persisted across requests. Yeah, but that's it for gotchas. I think we should go straight to the summary here. So what did we learn? Well, nice. The Nuxt.js composition API is a thing, right? It works. It provides Nuxt-specific functions. You can use the full beauty of the C API, and it gives lots of space to build your own composables. So you don't have to use fetch always at the same time. Just build a wrap around that, or maybe even use this low-level blocks to build your own stuff. Give it a try. Do it, enjoy it, and yeah, I would say shoot me with your questions after the next slide. So yeah, thanks a lot. I hope you learned a thing or two and enjoyed it. And yeah, I'm eagerly waiting for your questions.
Hey, Alex. Thanks for the great talk. I will be the mediator for the people who have questions. And as a first question in the list, like you covering a lot about the Nuxt, probably because you are a Nuxt core member as well. But
Yeah.
are the views still good without a Nuxt?
So I mean, it depends what you want to do. Of course, you can use plain Vue.js. That's no problem at all. And I think there's one use case where you should use plain Vue. For example, if you have, say, a Laravel or Django application, and you just want to sprinkle in, for example, like a reactive table or a modal or something, then go for Vue.js and add it to the script tag, for example. No problem at all. But if you build your whole front end, and it should be like a medium-sized or larger project, I personally, and I might be a bit biased here, I would always tend to use Nuxt.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So speaking about the Nuxt more specifically, in the first talk, we had kind of aligned that Nuxt doesn't have a full compatibility with the composition API yet. What blocks the Nuxt team to get there? Like, is there just a matter of time or any other specific reason?
So we're trying our best, of course, to see also what kind of direction the Vue 2 composition API plugin takes, because there are also still a few open issues there. And I think then the most important part is to figure out how to use the composition API with SSR in mind, because this is one thing that's not totally, but still to some extent missing in the composition API plugin. So especially Daniel, the maintainer of the Nuxt composition API module, is doing a really good job in figuring out how to do it the best way.
Yep. And for you personally, like what composable is still missed out throughout the development process? Like what you still lacking of?
So this is quite fun, because before I recorded and made the talk, I talked to Daniel about using use meta in a global context, and this wasn't possible at first. And then he just like, okay, just raise an issue, check it out, and he was like 2 hours later was like, okay, it's working now. So that was what I was missing, and that's also why I chose this use canonical example in the talk, because this is now working. So this was the main thing. I thought, okay, this would be cool, and yeah, now it's there.
Amazing. Yeah, that's the power of community. You can just write down your issue and yeah, it happens.
Exactly.
So, and also about this example about the fetch, you covered a lot about this one. And what about the WebSockets and the Vue.js and the Nuxt? Because this is kind of protocol and approach. It's not really covered a lot. So what's your personal opinion over that?
So you can definitely use WebSockets with Nuxt.js and also with Vue.js. I haven't, so I have to admit it, I haven't used it personally in lots of projects. I've played around with it a bit here and there. And I think there's also a Socket.io example in the Nuxt.js repository. But yeah, if there are like any more specific questions, for example, if someone has a project and is like, okay, I don't know how to proceed further, then always I'm open for DMs, and maybe I can help you out there.
Thank you. That's it what we have for now. So thanks again for the great talk, and yeah.
Thanks for having me.
let's go on. Yep.
Nice. Thank you for having a talk at our conference, and thank you, Vitaly, for your great questions. We're really happy to have you today, and we hope to see you, Alex, next year at our offline Vue.js conference.
That would be nice. Yeah, I'm all for it.